I think we're live. Well, thank you for joining us if you're here already, and good afternoon. I'm Liz. I am Senator McMurrow's Director of Constituent Services and District Outreach, and we are stoked to be able to continue these coffee hours while Senator McMurrow is out on maternity leave, and we are excited about today's opportunity. We are thrilled, honored, and thankful to the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History for partnering with us for this educational opportunity. We're joined with their Director of Education and Public Programs, Reggie, who will be giving this presentation, and I'll be watching alongside you guys, and I'll be joining back in at the end to help moderate some questions and maybe some questions you have about the presentation or the museum itself, but I will now bring him onto screen, or bring the presentation onto screen. Okay, I think, can you can you do a click present on your slide?
Okay.
Because all we see is us on camera.
How's that?
There we go. All right, well, I'll be leaving, and there we go. Perfect. All right, see you guys later.
All right, thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited to present to you today. Again, my name is Reggie Woolery. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Education at the Charles H. Wright Museum. We're located in Detroit in the Cultural Center District. One of our primary exhibitions right now is Voting Matters, and we're very excited about that, obviously, because this last 6 months to a year has all been about the issues related to voting. And we thought, when we were planning this, that we really want to focus on what have African Americans in particular contributed to this thing we consider the right to vote. What does that really mean? How have African Americans contributed to that? And obviously we wanted people to get out and vote and be excited about voting, knowing the history and what people put into acquiring the franchise. So Voting Matters is an interactive exhibition. We have touch screens that you can go through and look at the information, as well as these timelines. As you can see, very beautifully designed. It was constructed entirely curated by the staff. A lot of times you'll hear about traveling exhibitions from the Smithsonian or other places. This was constructed by our staff. So we did a lot of research, and a lot of things that we thought we knew, we found out just, were entirely different. So we're excited about that. There's 5 sections, pre-Reconstruction / Reconstruction Era, which we cover before the Civil War, 1863, to the end of Reconstruction, which is considered 1877. So pre-Reconstruction, and then the Reconstruction Era is 1877. We cover women's suffrage, we cover gerrymandering, and electoral college, and actually I left out one. I'm supposed to put in post-Reconstruction through the Civil Rights Movement. So that period after Reconstruction ends up to the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Act of 1965. So that's a very long period there, about 95 years. That's also in the exhibition. So I'm going to first cover the pre-Reconstruction, Reconstruction Era, and then I'm going to cover women's suffrage today. So hopefully you'll have some questions. I worked on this section, and I broke it up into 5 themes just to make it easier for people to pass through. So resistance, advocacy, registration, amendment, and election. And we're going to, touch on each of those themes as we move through the exhibition. Just some, pre-information. I gave a presentation to Homeland Security, Border Protection last year, and I compared enslavement of African peoples to human trafficking today. And we know human trafficking is a global phenomenon. People are put in servitude. Their labor is stolen from them, which goes to the people who have captured them. And this continues today. So it's a modern form of slavery people have talked about. And so just thinking about the enslavement period as human trafficking, the idea that human beings didn't control their labor. They didn't control their body, but they didn't control their labor. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, you see just an example of what the cotton industry was able to do during this period, shortly after the founding of our country. 1790 through 1860, but pre-Civil War era. So you have about more than like 700,000 people of African descent here in the United States, and about 4,000 bales of cotton being done during that time. And then you compare that to the pre-Civil War period, where you have almost 4 million people of African descent, and you can see the amount of cotton that was being produced. It was $1 billion industry for the South, and they didn't want to give that up. And what it meant for African peoples is they couldn't control their labor. You and I, if we go to a job, we get a paycheck, we control our labor. And so this was a very important issue for the Southern economy, the idea of being able to produce cotton and sell it to the factories in the North. Another important issue was the founding of the Republican Party, which was done in 1854. Originally, there was a party, there was the Democratic Party and there was the Whig Party. And the Whig Party was dissolved to create a new party that was more in opposition to slavery. So there were a number of abolitionists, both black and white, who were involved in the issue, and they helped to form this new party called the Republican Party. And we know, Lincoln was the president of the Republican Party, and I'm gonna give you more information about that. So this theme of resistance. So a lot of times you'll hear in school that slavery wasn't as bad because people were taken care of, and they really didn't resist. It was kind of paternalistic system. But we know that's not true. We know that people resisted in many different types of ways. Whether they were in their working, they would slow down, whether it was armed rebellion on the plantations, whether it was sabotage of equipment or people trying to escape on the Underground Railroad. Captives expressed their desire to be free, like any of us would want to be free. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln gave those who were enslaved in the South opportunity to come to the North and fight for their freedom. And this was one of the major decisions that led to the victory for the Union. And so the next theme is advocacy. And there's a number of different people who were involved in advocacy, most notable Frederick Douglass, but also Sojourner Truth. We know that Harriet Tubman was actively bringing people to escape from the Underground Railroad to the North. And Frederick is known for his oratory. And here's one quote from him: "A man's rights rest in 3 boxes, the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. Let no man be kept from the ballot box because of his color. Let no woman be kept from the ballot box because of her sex." And by cartridge box, Douglass is suggesting armed defiance. And so if you can't win success at the ballot box or at the jury box, the idea of armed struggle was a real thing. And as you see in this quote, he's referring to that there was a connection between the women's suffrage movement and the larger struggle to have everyone to have universal right to vote, which would later, these two areas would split. Another theme is registration. Registering to vote was very important part of this time period. It's said by 1863, after the Civil War, every to vote. Mississippi, 83% of people were registered on the rolls. I saw an episode of Henry Louis Gates does a show where he investigates people's roots, and he had on John Lewis, the congressman who recently passed away. And John Lewis, he showed him a picture of his great grandfather registering to vote in about 1863 and 1867. And here it was present day, and John Lewis had been very active in getting people the right to vote, to actively go out and vote, to get to register in the South. And it had actually been, when he saw that, John Lewis started crying, because between the time of his great grandfather registering and the time that another person in his family voted, it was almost 95 years. So that's in this entire period, African Americans were not voting after the fall of Reconstruction. So some Black representatives were helping to write new constitutions and complaints against the system. People were actively involved in running for office, state office, becoming a part of the electoral college, electors in the state assemblies. So there was all this organization before the amendment passed to give them the right to vote. And so that's the next theme is amendment. The 15th Amendment expanded the right to vote and was ratified in 1869 and was enacted in 1870. More than 500,000 Black men and poor white citizens, because in the South, the vote was mostly held by white plantation owners. If you had property, you could vote. If you didn't have property, you were discouraged or you couldn't vote. And so the 15th Amendment allowed everyone the right to vote except women. They became voters in the South during this time. And as we're going to talk about later, women didn't receive the right to vote until 1920. For the most part, African-American voters voted the Republican Party because this was the party of Abraham Lincoln and his, the Emancipation Proclamation was something that was very vivid in their mind. When Mississippi returned to the Union in 1870, former slaves made up more than half of the state's population. During the next decade, Mississippi sent 2 Black senators to Washington and elected a number of Black state officials, including a lieutenant governor. So as you can see the picture in the upper right-hand corner of African-American person voting. It wasn't easy. Even then there was attempts at voter suppression to keep African-Americans from voting. As you can see in these pictures, the race issue never really went away. People are being intimidated on the left. This idea, if you could read what this placard says, it says there's 2 platforms. The Democratic platform is for the white man, and the Republican platform is for the Negro and the carpetbagger, looking at them as people who were just trying to steal power. And then here's a drawing on the right from Harper's Weekly. And so we know that at least 11 African-American legislators were elected to Congress, 500 to state legislatures, over 2,000 African-Americans held elected office in full, from the local level to the U.S. Senate. 265 African-Americans were elected delegates at state constitutional conventions, and then more than 100 were former slaves, primarily in South Carolina and Louisiana. So we see here with Benjamin S. Turner, with this little graphic, he wasn't a former slave. He was a member of the Republican Party. He represented Alabama in the 1st district, and he was in office for 2 years. And we know that in January 1870, the first African-American senator, Hiram Levels, a former slave, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. And as you can see, Hiram Levels on the left here for Mississippi. And here's some other congressmen that were elected during that particular time. Benjamin Turner, Josiah Walls, Jefferson Long, Joseph Rainey, Robert Elliott, and Robert Carlos DeLarge. Again, a number of them had been former slaves or enslaved, and some were not. They were born free and they ran for office. Now, as I mentioned earlier about the economics of enslavement, billions of dollars are being lost by the South by African Americans, one, being able to elect people who represented their interest, to make their lives more free. People like Frederick Douglass, when he was enslaved, he never knew his birthday. And so he just chose a date out of time, just any date. He chose February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, as his birthday. So people were able to change their name. They were able to get married, to buy homes, to try to live a real life. But again, this was something that affected the economy, and people did not want African Americans to have that freedom. And so you had groups rise like the Red Shirts, the White League, and the Ku Klux Klan, who openly intimidated African American people and try to keep them from voting. Eventually, because of the growing congressional power of the South through the Democratic Party, there was a compromise where federal troops stopped maintaining order and civility in the South, and people returned to Jim Crow status, not being able to vote, not feeling safe to vote, being charged poll taxes, having to take literacy tests, or just face violence in general if they wanted to vote. So that pretty much covered the, I just want to give you an overview about that time period and how African Americans contributed to that. Even more so, I want to talk about the role of women. If you think about this recent presidential election, with the role that Stacey Abrams played, a number of people played in Georgia, and just around the country, organizing people to vote, African American women have been very important to this process. Women in general, obviously, have been very important to the process. They were not awarded the right to vote, which they fought for 72 more years after the 15th Amendment, until the 19th Amendment was passed on August 18th, 1920. And just last August, was the 100th anniversary of women receiving the right to vote. And so the period of Black women's suffrage is broken into 3 different generations, 3 different groups of women organized, and they played very different roles. So there was the abolitionist movement period that were, pre-Civil War, pre-1865, women who were inspirational speakers, who spoke out against slavery, but also spoke in favor of women receiving the right to vote. One of the more famous is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner took this name after she was able to achieve her freedom. And it says, from the very beginning, women's suffrage was racially divided. Many Black women that wanted to participate in the general women's suffrage movement were kept out by their white counterparts. And they were angered because African American men, like Frederick Douglass, who had been their ally, received the right to vote, and they didn't. So they shunned African American women who began organizing on their own. But Sojourner Truth was able to deliver one of her most famous speeches at a women's convention in 1851. You can go look it up and read it, but it's entitled "Ain't I a Woman?" Speaking about how she was being kept out of this process for freedom. Sojourner was one of the most widely known African American women of the 19th century, rivaled only by Harriet Tubman, who was 25 years younger than she was. And so Sojourner's life connects the women's activism with the civil rights in the Civil War period. I love this photo of her. I had cropped it, but I'm very much interested in photography, and as somebody who works at a museum, this is a very beautiful piece. It's a 2.5 inch by 4 inch cardboard postcard. Some of you may have one of these in your collection. It's called a carte de visite, or like a calling card. And she used these to sell in order to pay her way around for her speaking engagements. And there's a beautiful quote. First, she's claiming all legal rights to her likeness. People weren't exploiting her likeness. And she copyrighted them in her own name in 1864. And she captioned them, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And I really love that. That's really beautiful. She's one of the very early realized, obviously as a woman who was not married, she didn't have property. So she needed to make money to be able to be independent. And so speaking and being able to package her image and sell her image was very important to her. To control her body, that was the whole idea of controlling your labor. So she was a very important person during that time. Her and Frederick Douglass working together to support the end of slavery and the right to vote. So her presence served as the challenge to racism, which was deeply embedded in the white suffrage movement. Then there was the second generation Black women of suffrage, and these women formed auxiliary groups, and they started newspapers. So this is post-Civil War up to the end of the 18th century, 19th century. So one of these individuals was Frances Harper. She was an orphan, and she was very early knew how to write, and she was a poet. She took up the cause in Maryland, and which had passed the fugitive state law, which means that former slaves could be picked up, arrested, and sold back into the South. She formed alliances with the main women's suffrage movement, people like Susan B. Anthony, and she began giving speeches throughout the United States. She presented her poetry and her writing, and she just elevated the issues of racism, feminism, and classism. And here's a quote: "The ballot in the hands of women means power added to the influence." Just to the idea that a lot of times women are thought to have influence and not power, but the ballot, she says, adds that power. And she addressed the World Congress of Representative Women at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Another advocate was Sarah Jane Smith Thompson Garnet. She founded the Equal Rights League. Now, a lot of times you had African-American people, even before they had the right to vote, get people interested in voting. Why is it important? They were advocates, they were organizers, they were activists. They were encouraging people to get involved. She served as a superintendent of suffrage for the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded at the 1896, and became the first African-American woman to become a principal of a New York City school system. She understood the importance of education, and understood the importance of having the right to vote your interest. Then there was a third generation of women that were very politically active and formed national organizations. Among them were Margaret Hawkins, Estelle Young, and Augusta Chisel. And here's a marker to these women. I believe it's out in front of the house, one of the houses that they used to organize in. And I'm just going to read part of this. As leaders of the Bois Circle, an African-American women's club founded in 1907, Margaret Hawkins and Estelle Young brought women of their race together for change. The group grew out of W.E.B. Du Bois's Niagara movement, which was established in 1905, and it was a precursor to the NAACP. Several young women were invited to be hostesses and ushers at the meeting held in Baltimore's Lyric Theater to publicize the Niagara movement. But wanting to do more than just, support, a handful formed their own auxiliary group, Du Bois Circle, named after the scholar and activist who was their mentor. So Beverly Carter, historian and archivist for the Du Bois Circle, said the group sought knowledge and a way to connect it to the community. And through it, they expanded their scope. They participated in political activities as well as civic activities as a group, and then they addressed the voting issue. And it says they joined a collaboration of Black women nationwide, many who organized under the NAA, National Association of Colored Women, the largest federation of Black women clubs. So there were clubs throughout the United States, and people formed, as I said, the Du Bois Circle began to expand, and these two organizations began to work together. Most notable, some of you know Ida B. Wells, her stature. As a journalist, she spoke out against anti-lynching when many people were afraid to talk about it, and she was a founding member of the NAACP. She's a lecturer, an activist, and an educator. She is known to have attended a suffragette parade, and they were encouraging her to go to the back of the parade, and she was like, "I'm not having it. We're all in this together." And she always stood tall and stood strong. And at that particular parade, she marched with women in the front. At first, Black suffragettes had been rejected from joining, but Wells and others wrote letters asking to allow Black women to participate in the movement. Eventually, organizers acquiesced, and with one condition, that Black suffragettes march again in the back. It was meant to assuage the feelings of Southern white women, but Wells refused those terms. In 1885, Wells also published The Red Record, a book in which she documented the number of African Americans who had been murdered by lynch mobs. And when we think about today, just the people in the streets young people mostly, but people in the streets around African American deaths due to police brutality. This is some of the same things that Ida B. Wells was talking about, the idea that Black lives didn't seem to matter to anyone, and that people were dying and being lynched every day. And she wrote about it, she spoke about it, and was a very important figure during that time. And one of the last people I want to speak about is Mary Church Terrell of Memphis, Tennessee. She was the daughter of former enslaved peoples. You can see she's very light-skinned, meaning either there was intermarriage or that she was a child of a plantation owner and an enslaved person. She fought for women's suffrage and civil rights and served as the first national president of the National Association of Colored Women between 1897 and 1901. And if you come to the exhibition, there's even more information about Mary Church Terrell, or you could find it online. All of these women did incredible work, and they're kind of like hidden figures within this larger struggle of achieving the right to vote and what it means to vote. And the last is Juno Frankie Pierce. And it's 3 months before Tennessee lawmakers were considering passing the 19th Amendment. She spoke at a meeting of the League of Women Voters of Tennessee. And again, this is 1920, and the passage was in August of 1920. As the only African-American woman to speak that day, Pierce addressed the convention for the women of her race. "What will the Negro woman do with the vote?" she asked those gathered in the chamber. "We will stand by white women." She told those at the meeting that Black women sought suffrage to receive a square deal. She died before the civil rights movement of the 1960s took hold in Nashville, where rights were further extended. And actually, even with the passage of the 19th Amendment, again, most African American people could not vote because of the intimidation of the Klan, Jim Crow laws, all of these different intimidation tactics, repressing their right to vote. But working in coalition, slowly but surely, all these women work together to make life in the U.S. just a better place to be. All right, that ends my general presentation. I know it was kind of short, but I wanted just to cover some general topics and see if maybe we had questions from people about it.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in our comments right now, but I guess I have one if we want to wait some time to get those comments. So as someone that believes in the Democratic Party, works for someone as the Democratic caucus, I saw the Ku Klux Klan organized within the Democratic Party. Are you able to talk about maybe this shift in the parties or not? Because it's kind of alarming,
Yeah, no, people always ask. That's the question people always ask. That's why I love presenting that part. I think that, first I want to say that other than George Washington, a lot of the energy around elections was not around presidents. It was around Congress, right? It was about this fight between representatives who made the laws, because the president doesn't make the laws, right? And so it was about these two parties, and the Republican Party is the party that was formed to advocate against enslavement. But as we move into the 20th century, I think it was around, and I wanted to have the president's name, but a lot of it had to do with, I don't want to say just the New Deal, but just programs to help impoverished people. The shift went for the Democratic Party. So I'm going to get the date for you at some point, but it's around 1920 or so that people of African descent shifted from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party.
Okay.
Right? And it became more consistently working within that party to eventually achieve the right to vote through Lyndon Baines Johnson, and continue to stick with the Democratic Party, even though, again, we have associations, but really it's about who represents your interests, right? Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions besides Diana, who asked if this was going to be videotaped. It'll be on our YouTube and our Facebook, and we'll send it out in an e-news as well. But if no one else has any questions, do you have any signing off comments, I think?
Well, I just encourage people to come to the museum.
Mm-hmm.
We have a mobile app which you can download from the App Store or Google Play. It has a number of exhibitions, including Voting Matters. You can get more information about the
Mm-hmm.
exhibition there. The other sections that I didn't mention, the Electoral College, which also became a very big part of this election, how it's tied to race. I didn't mention gerrymandering. And, there are a number of citizens groups which are helping to redraw district lines in cities to get away from political manipulation. So all these are really current issues that people didn't really know about. So I think if you come and see the exhibition, you'll learn more about the electoral process, and in particular, how African Americans have contributed to that. So.
Okay, I see one question actually.
All right, great.
They said, right? I am aware that voting rights for people who are incarcerated and returning citizens varies greatly by state, but why are decisions about enfranchisement and disenfranchisement made at a state level? Are there other examples of enfranchisement decisions that are made at the state level? For example, could a single state change the voting age?
Yes. I think, as a republic, we believe very much, and people have fought, particularly in the South, around states' rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why a lot of African Americans didn't vote for many years, because the states, individual states, not the federal government, but individual states made decisions about poll taxes or certain tests you had to pass in order to be able to vote. And we see even in the current election, there were some attempts to change rules state by state about, could you mail in your ballot, or, could you do certain things? And so what we want to do is we want to just stay alert and active of anything that would suppress the right of anybody to vote. I mean, again, people have said all votes should count. That's really what we're trying to do. And we know that the Voting Rights Act of 65 has to keep being ratified. So there's a possibility that African Americans at some point wouldn't receive the right to vote, even though we think, of course not in this day and age. So, and it's also, you saw a lot during the election, conspiracy theories that were the main idea behind those were to make people not believe in the importance of their government. It wasn't about the theory itself. It was just getting people to question that their vote counted and that it mattered.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's very specific things states can do, but also there are outside actors that always want to try to convince people that their one vote doesn't matter. And we have to just continue to remind them that people fought for it, men and women of different backgrounds and classes, and it's important. So I appreciate you hosting this session so we could just talk about some of that.
Yeah, and I think with the previous election, it really shows that each vote does really matter, like a whole lot. So another question we have, were there any, prominent white men who fought for the voting rights at all?
Oh, there were many abolitionists who fought anti-slavery first, because at first, again, African people were not considered even citizens or real people. I mean, if we think about, I'm just going to go back a little bit further to the Electoral College. All states paid through taxes to the federal government so that it could exist. So, and they did that based on land, the value of their land. And eventually people depreciated the price of their land because they didn't want to keep paying taxes to the federal government. And so they came up with a new system basing it on population. And so, but a lot of the southern states had African population that was huge because they were enslaved peoples. So they came up with what's called the 3/5 compromise. And what that meant was they were going to count 60% of African people as in the congressional numbers, so that those states would get more Congress people, but they would also pay more taxes. And we should really look this up. This is a very important issue for people of African descent. So the 3/5 compromise allowed 3/5 or 60% of African population to be counted. That increased Southern numbers, and that's how they continue to grow in power. Again, they were counted, but they weren't allowed to vote. And this is part of what still happens today. And I'm gonna get back to the question. This what still happens today around voter suppression is you want the people to be counted because you can get representation through that, but you don't want them to vote. So it's, these are things that have been going on for a very long time. But abolitionists fought for first that people of African descent could be free as human beings. A lot of them were believed in God, and they just thought it was wrong. People will say, if you ask people of African descent about Abraham Lincoln and why the Emancipation Proclamation, they'll argue he didn't do it to free the slaves. He did it for practical reasons. Either way, his decision led to a lot of white men being killed in order to have this happen, because it was pulling the country apart. So, here you have people of African descent picking up weapons and fighting their former employers, masters, overseers. And this is the only time this has ever happened in U.S. history. So that's a great question. And there were quite a number of people. And again, it's about allies and all of us seeing ourselves as equals, both men and women. And again, Frederick Douglass was very much a part of helping women to get the right to vote. But when that crucial moment came, when only men got the right to vote, there was a split there as well. So, all these things throughout history about coalition building and people finding ways to compromise and split, come back together. So.
Okay, and then we have a question about the museum. They want to know about how crowded the museum is right now. They want to see this exhibit, but are concerned about the crowds because of the pandemic. Very
good question. We would love to come back to where we were pre-pandemic. We took it for granted. All the museums did. We probably saw 30,000 school kids per year.
Wow.
And we also went out across the state through a grant from the legislature. We Too Are Michigan grant, which was given to us, the Holocaust Memorial Center and the Arab American Museum, to go out across the state and present our programs. And so we're not able to do either one of those things. But a lot of my staff have learned PowerPoint really quickly. And so we're able to give, we're learning, like, what's Zoom again? What is this thing?
Yeah.
So a lot of us have really learned how to do these virtual presentations. But all the museums within the Cultural District, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Historical Society, we've all worked together to have a COVID plan. There is time ticketing. If you have a reservation, only so many people can come into the museum per day, where normally it might be 5,000 people a day. At the most, we have 250 people come into the museum. So if you were to come, you would be safe. There's signage everywhere about masks and 6-foot distancing. And so we haven't had any problem. And if you wanted to come, you could just book a reservation online.
Awesome. All right. Well, those are all the questions I'm seeing. I just want to say thank you again for joining us. This was an amazing presentation. I watched the entire time, just sucked in like this. So
great.
Thank you again for joining us, and looking forward to future opportunities with you guys.
All right. Thank you so much.